Welcome to our podcast. My name is Keely Severson, and I'm here with my co-hosts Eric Johnson and Alicia Swami, and we are exposing mold. Today we are here with Nicole Bijlsma from Australia. Welcome, Nicole. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I understand that you have been injured primarily by EMF exposure, and that was the path that brought you into mold illness. Can you share your history and information with us?
Sure. I was working as a naturopath and acupuncturist for 15 years. And during that time, I started to notice a very strong correlation between many of my patients' illnesses with asthma, allergies, fatiguing syndromes, autoimmune and infertility with issues in the house. And by the third consultation, many of my patients were saying, what do you think about the mold in the house? And when I looked at their symptoms, I realized that it started when they moved into these environments. Now, I didn't learn anything about this. I spent 8 years at university doing naturopathy and acupuncture qualifications and further training in China, and we didn't cover environmental sensitivities until what happened next was I moved into our first home. I then developed sleep disturbances, as did my husband, and I went on and had 10 miscarriages in this house. We saw many therapists and doctors and IVFs. We didn't qualify for IVF, and we went to the recurrent miscarriage clinic here in Melbourne, and they excluded all pathology and said, we cannot help you. So the medical profession were unable to help us. At that time, about 5 years into it, my neighbour said, no one successfully had children in your home. It was 65 years old. And that piqued my interest that there's something wrong with the house because we developed sleep disturbances when we moved in. So we were on half an acre of this beautiful land on the river. And what I realized is we were sleeping on the other side of the wall of the meter panel. And of course, at that time, there was just a handful of studies on miscarriage rates and AC magnetic fields. I also got a dowser in, and he confirmed there was G-padic stress directly beneath the bed. We were on a T intersection of a road, and I started to measure the noxious gases coming from traffic-related air pollutants, and they would triple in the morning in our master bedroom, which was closest to the road, and take 3 hours to dissipate. They include carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide. And the last thing is Parks Victoria, because we bordered the Yarra River, Parks Victoria used to regularly come and spray our property for pesticides. So even though you couldn't see what the issues were, when you started to investigate, there were several red flags on the property that made me start to think about environmental exposures. So I looked at the US EPA's website and realized there's a huge amount of data on indoor air quality, and wondering why I was never taught this. So for the next 2 decades, I started to research the impact of electromagnetic fields, mold, and chemicals on human health. And then in 1999, I started the Australian College of Environmental Studies, which examines health hazards in the home, mold, electromagnetic field, toxicants, allergens. And for over 2 decades, I've been teaching people. I created the industry building biology here in Australia, and we train people to walk into homes to identify if there are hazards. Most of the work we do is referred through doctors, and about 60% of the work we do is assessing water damaged buildings. So what I've discovered here in Australia is there is systemic failures across multiple industries that is leading to a huge array of people being exposed to environmental sensitivities, including mold. In the past 3 decades, several things happened that dramatically escalated the Australian population to water damaged buildings. And the first of those was changes from copper water pipes to flexible braided water hoses. Flexible braided water hoses are those things under the sink. They're easy to install so that the plumbing costs are a lot less, but they are the #1 cause of water damage claims in Australia, accounting for about $320 million annually in insurance claims. So they burst very quickly, and they only have a service life of 5 years. Most people don't know that. The second thing is waterproofing. What happened about 2 decades ago is the government changed the technical schools which meant that generally young males who used to get into the trades, they're the majority of our cohort in trades, would go to tech school and learn how to do a craft over many years and then become a plumber, electrician, etc. That stopped about 3 decades ago. So in order to become a waterproofing consultant, a lot of the trades are just getting what we call recognition of prior learning. So instead of going to a TAFE or a technical college, they're learning it from their builder, their employer, who may or may not have good practices in waterproofing. Those that are going to the TAFE, they're going to TAFEs that are under-resourced. So they're learning how to do a bathroom waterproofing course, but they don't know how to do external below grade waterproofing, which is very, very different. So what's happening is we're getting a large generation of trades who are waterproofing bathrooms very poorly, often not in the manufacturer's specs. And as a result of that, these bathrooms are only lasting around 7 years. Most people don't realise if they paid at least $2,000 for a bathroom renovation in waterproofing, where they had a company specialising in that, the waterproofing would last up to 30 years using proper sheet-based membranes as opposed to liquid-based membranes. So the problem is our bathrooms are failing in a very short period of time. And in addition to that, a lot of the clients are using essential oils in order to clean bathrooms. And these essential oils are very strong, like eucalyptus, for example, and they are degrading the waterproof membrane. So when they're using them in the bathroom, they're penetrating into the grout. It's then dissolving the waterproof membrane in the wall. And as a result of that, instead of 7 years lasting, it's only lasting 2 or 3 years. So these are big issues that occupants are not aware of, that using essential oils, D-limonene, orange, citrus, peel, eucalyptus, tea tree, that they should never be using them for cleaning purposes. So that's another one. The third one is they started to change the way in which buildings are built to make them tighter. So instead of being a bit drafty and having ventilation, they now have to be built based on a 6-star energy rating. So essentially we're building plastic bags. It means that it's a lot of these new buildings, according to the research, 40% of new builds in temperate climates here in Australia are demonstrating condensation and mold by their first winter, often hidden in the roof void and in the walls. And this is because they're so tight that just living in these buildings and you're breathing out 3 litres of water vapour a day, this water vapour is going through the gyprock and or drywall, as you refer to, and then it's hitting a cold surface, an impermeable waterproof membrane, and it's now condensing. So you don't even see the mold, but people are starting to get asthma and allergies and other things like that. So there are also, in building practices, they're building homes without an eave. Eaves are very important. It's like the hat of the home because it protects against wind-driven rain. The last thing are gutters. A lot of the gutters are failing because they people aren't actually maintaining them. They're clogging up, etc. And this is causing moisture to penetrate into the roof void. So there are a lot of problems here that are resulting in a significant escalation in mold and condensation in the homes in Australia.
Thank you for sharing that information. We're seeing it here in the United States, and it's a pretty, it's the wild, wild west out here, basically, even though we have standards, the IICRC and all that sort, but it seems like mold inspectors and remediation is still trying to come up with a solution to this because not all remediation works, right? And so I'm just curious as to you transforming from who you were in health to now building biology. Like what's going on in that sector in Australia right now?
Well, we're finding because testing for mold and remediation is not regulated, people who bother to do the IICRC water restoration and applied microbial remediation course are doing the course over a week. They don't have time to consolidate the course and they go back to their old ways. So if they've been remediating for 20 years, they do a week course, do an online test at the end, and then because they haven't had time to consolidate and get feedback, they're going back to fogging, they're going back to not testing. And the IICRC course doesn't cover testing. So when you have remediators who haven't learned how to establish a scope of works, that's a problem. So the big red flag when I'm telling clients about what to look for, the first thing is if the remediator is giving you a quote over the phone and they haven't assessed your building, run in the opposite direction and put the phone down, because you need to put the money into testing to establish what's going on with the building. And the reality is that's not cheap. It's got to be done properly. What we're finding is people are coming in, they're remediating, they're fogging. Fogging introduces more moisture. It exacerbates the problem. But because it temporarily sterilizes the air, they're doing air testing. They can wipe the surface, then do a biotape and show that it's clean, but it's only temporarily sterilized. And they know by keeping their air purifiers on when they're testing the air that it's going to be hardly anything in the air. I'll often know when I look at a sample, they had the air purifier on because there's only a few spores per cubic meter of air. So that's not right. A healthy home has up to 500 spores per centimetre squared on the surface. People think mold is the problem. It is not the problem. Fungi are everywhere from the Arctic to the Antarctica. The issue is that most of the spores in a healthy home relate to what the spores are in the soil and the soil ecology immediately around the home and the area. So you have high levels, or you mainly have ascospores and basidiospores. When you start getting water, now if you have liquid water on a surface for 48 hours or more, or you have elevated humidity because you live in a humid environment for 48 hours or more, and we're talking at least 70% humidity for more than, and you only have 48 hours, the spores sitting in the surface of your home and the household dust and the carpets are going to be utilizing the moisture from the air, and they'll start releasing enzymes. They'll start infiltrating onto the substrate and eating that, so to speak. They'll be releasing microbial VOCs because they're trying to kill each other off and their competitors in the process of decomposing your house. So the key and the problem here is moisture. Liquid water is the same. If it sits on the surface for more than 48 hours, the fungi and eventually bacteria will get involved if it's long-standing water problems because their water activity is 0.9 or higher, will then infiltrate the substrate and they'll release mycotoxins and microbial VOCs. These are some of the deadliest chemicals known to humans, which is why many patients in long-standing water-damaged homes end up with anxiety, depression, and of course, potentially psychosis or mold rage. So the thing with mold is understanding you have a very short period of time to address this before it can become an adverse health effect. These fungal particulate spores and hyphae start infiltrating when there's growth because there's moisture, and then it causes what we call condition 2, which is high levels of settled spores in the house. That alone can cause adverse health effects. Some of the worst homes I've ever seen, you could not see or smell mold, but the key is to take a proper environmental exposure history, which is what we train our consultants to do. And the first thing is asking the timing of symptoms is critical. When did your symptoms begin? Or when were they exacerbated? And more often than not, it's when they moved into this water damaged home or after a renovation where the builder came, pulled out the bathroom, opened up the wall where there's lots of hidden mold, and now they've contaminated the adjacent rooms and potentially the whole house. So you can see the timing of exposure. Asking clients, have you ever been in a water damaged home before? Is any of the furnishings in this home been in a previously water damaged home? Because then you can contaminate the next house. Many of these patients don't get better because they're bringing their water damaged contents from one house to the other, and they continue to be sick. And as you know, unless they're taking binders, the enterohepatic circulation keeps recycling these toxins. So even when they're in a home that's dry, they can still be sick until they've seen the right clinician to help them remove these biotoxins. The other thing we're finding is once people become sick with mold-related illness like SIRS, they then become electrically sensitive, they become chemically sensitive. So you have to look at their exposures to electromagnetic fields, their exposures to Wi-Fi enabled devices, because the myelin sheath is being impacted, the mitochondria is impacted, they have low-grade systemic inflammation and particular inflammation in their brain, which is impacting key neuropeptides, melanocyte stimulating hormone, vasoactive intestinal polypeptide. They have multiple infections going on in the body as a result of it. Their gut is becoming more permeable. They then get gluten intolerance and food intolerances, and it's a very vicious cycle. So what we train them to do is to look at testing water damaged buildings appropriately by identifying moisture and moisture-laden material. You have to remove moisture-laden material because it will be a continual source of microbes and mycotoxins and fungi and fungal particulate. You have to establish the boundary of particulate, of fungal particulate. If you're not testing the air and or surfaces to see how far that fungal particulate has moved from the source of growth, then you can never adequately remediate. And the problem is 90% of homes that are being remediated here in Australia, they haven't even tested the buildings. So it's impossible to remediate if you don't know how far that boundary is. If you don't test every room, if you don't test the roof, if you don't test the subfloor, you don't know potentially where the microbial growth is. You need thermal imaging cameras, you need moisture meters, and you need to do proper testing to see how far it's spread to establish the boundary before you can develop a scope of works and properly remediate. Then remediation, of course, involves the porosity of the material and the condition. And those two bits of information tell you exactly what you need to do to contents and the built structure.
Just one thing that I wanted to bring back, reiterate, to make sure everybody heard this, is that a lot of people are getting these credentials under false pretenses because they just do it to put letters next to their name when they go right back to whatever they were doing before.
Absolutely, we see this all the time. And the problem is, part of the problem is the training. What's being taught is great, but if you teach it in a short period of time, like I run a registered training organisation that's government accredited, we would not be able to teach courses in a short space. We have to space it over 3 months in order to ensure students have the time to really integrate what's taught and to test the application of that knowledge is important. Just doing an online test at the end of a 3-day full-on course of 5 days isn't going to have time to really consolidate that. So when you have remediators who've got 20 years experience doing a week course, becoming IICRC certified, then going back to their old practices because they really haven't had time to consolidate that knowledge, that is problematic. But that's the best we have for mold remediation currently in Australia and the US, etc. The course is good. It just needs to be weaned out. You need multiple forms of assessment to actually test the application of that knowledge. The mold testing course we offer here at my college is 150 hours in duration. We're not teaching remediation. We're just teaching testing water damaged buildings and how to do an environmental exposure history, you know, how to actually use thermal imaging and moisture mapping, how to do lab testing, how to set up a lab plan and then test and then analyze those results in the context of the exposure history. You have to assess risk. The problem is we're never going to have dose response relationships when it comes to mold. How much aspergillus do you need to have asthma? How much chitomium do you need to have, you know, skin rashes, for example? We're never going to have that because you have to assess the risk. If you've got someone with SIRS slightly elevated above the outdoor is a problem. In addition to that, I often find with patients that not only have they been exposed previously to other water damage, they could have tick bites, they could have been exposed to blue-green algae in rivers, but many of them have been exposed to high levels of chemicals or ongoing chemicals, which accelerated their risk for mold illness. Some of them have been exposed to ongoing electromagnetic fields. The problem with electromagnetic fields in mold is that EMFs can potentiate the impact of biotoxins and chemicals in the body because it enhances the permeability of the blood-brain barrier. It also causes significant oxidative stress because it acts on voltage-gated calcium channels in the brain, the heart, and the testes. This is electromagnetic fields from all your Wi-Fi enabled devices, accelerates oxidative stress and causes low-grade systemic inflammation. So you have this synergistic effect between mold illness, electromagnetic field exposures, and potentially chemicals in the body. Once they are sensitive to one, you have to look at all three of them. You have to change their behavior about electromagnetic fields, how they use their cell phones, you know, if they're sleeping near meter panels, if they're sleeping near mobile phone base stations, all of these other things have to be addressed. Otherwise, these patients generally never get better.
Well, are you in contact with Professor or Dr. Sonia Marshall-Gradisnik at Griffith University, who's looking into ion channelopathy?
No, I'm not.
I would definitely look her up.
Absolutely. I'll get those details after this.
Fantastic.
Eric, do you want to describe a little bit about what her work is in and what they're doing? Because it's pretty cool.
Well, Griffith University has been trying to solve the mystery of myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, for quite a few years. And they've come across a specific test, patch clamp testing, that identifies certain types of ion channelopathy, a TRPM3, transient receptor potential melastatin 3 ion channel that is severely impaired in what they call MECFS. They're not looking to mold at this time, but they see this pathophysiology in their MECFS patients, and they're trying to work this into a possible test, a diagnostic tool to identify MECFS.
Interesting. Well, there's in my book, Dominic Belpome is one of the leading researchers in the world. He's based in France on electromagnetic sensitivities and CFS. And he's got some amazing papers on electromagnetic sensitivity. The interesting thing, like in my book, what I look at is comparing multiple chemical sensitivity, electromagnetic sensitivity with mold illness, and there's 75% the same presentation because it's low-grade systemic inflammation. So with electromagnetic fields, they have almost identical symptoms to mold illness. The difference is they often will have more severe headaches and tinnitus, ringing in the ears, and heart-related pathology. So, you know, palpitations and things like that. Many ears disease, which is an imbalance disorder with dizziness, tends to be more electromagnetic sensitivities. So what differentiating between the three pathologies, we realize that they're incredibly similar. And ultimately, what's happening is this oxidative stress, low-grade systemic inflammation across many of these illnesses, especially environmental sensitivities. So in the end, to get these patients better, you have to educate them how to reduce their exposure to toxicants and chemicals, especially pesticides are one of the worst. Get the Great Plains GPL tox test to assess chemical load, petrochemicals, all those things, because a lot of these patients won't get better if that is not addressed. Looking at their gene profiles, not just for the HLA for the mold, but also their detoxification pathways, because this can impact whether they get better or not. And of course, looking at their exposures to mold, electromagnetic fields and chemicals, and reducing that as much as possible by altering their behavior.
I see you made a reference to CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, Dr. Shoemaker's term for the overall umbrella toxic soup type illness. But if you look into it and identify somebody as specifically being made sick by blue-green algae or Stachybotrys or a brown recluse spider bite, do you then give them an additional name so you know exactly what they're dealing with?
Well, I think in the end, the environmental exposure history is really useful because you're able to establish root cause by going through the timeline, finding out what symptoms happen when, what exposures happen when. In the end, I feel the diagnosis is not that important. I think we've spent so much time in medicine and even in natural therapies putting people in boxes, which hasn't necessarily helped their illness. What we should be doing is taking a proper environmental exposure history and identifying the timing of exposure and development of symptoms to get to the root cause to ensure they're not continually exposed. From my experience, every one of the patients with CIRS or environmental sensitivities has been exposed to multiple factors before the development of chronic inflammatory response. It seems like the mold is the last straw, but they may have been exposed to high levels of pesticides in farming communities or, in electromagnetic fields as part of their career or as part of their use or their, career in terms of using cell phones next to their head for 6 hours a day for 20 years. So I think we need to start moving away from the boxes because they're not helping these patients. And in the end, ultimately what you want to do is get to the root cause and then address that and reduce the inflammation and the biotoxins in the body by treating them as best you can. Obviously, markers are becoming more and more aware of what markers are involved with these. I've mentioned a couple of those. And being able to identify, yes, this is potentially more mold illness, but a really good environmental exposure history should be able to identify that.
Well, I'm here in Nevada and we've got a huge arsenic problem. And
Yeah.
it's vital to know that because you can make all the difference in the world by moving from one well system, one water system to another that has less arsenic. So if you get a diagnosis, it's kind of important to parse out exactly what your exposure is. And I was thinking with SIRS, if you were made sick, for example, by blue-green algae, and you were in an area that had an ongoing problem, you'd want to be told that so that you could think about moving somewhere else.
Absolutely, definitely. And you're right, bore water and well water is very at risk if you're drinking from that because of flame retardants, industrial pollution, pesticides, arsenic, which could be naturally from the geology of the rock in the area. For example, arsenic is very high in countries like Bangladesh and things like that. And as a result of that, it's very high in rice. A lot of rice is high in arsenic. Wood treated timber, CCA treated timber is high in arsenic. Arsenic is a group 1 carcinogen, so it will dramatically impact your immune response. So I think part of SIRS is to actually assess toxic load across all chemicals using the GPL tox test by the Great Plains Laboratory, because a lot of these patients could have significant environmental exposures that are impacting their ability to detox the mold. There's some interesting research coming from pharmaceutical, and where they found that some people cannot detox paracetamol very well for pain relief, and they end up with liver toxicity. And what they found is in this small subset of patients is that they have bacteria in their gut, Clostridia difficile, which is very common in autism, for example, and it's creating metabolites, p-cresol sulfate, which is blocking the detoxification pathways, which paracetamol needs to go down. And as a result, paracetamol is forced to go through a different detoxification pathway, glucuronidation, using all the glutathione, and now they're getting really sick. So what I'm saying is that in patients with environmental sensitivities, if they have any parasites or infections in their gut, that could be dramatically escalating their impact and exposures to mold, chemicals, and potentially electromagnetic fields, because there are gut pathogens in their gut that are impacting how they detox, yeast metabolites and other things like that, which is very common in mold-related illness. So as a result of that, the catecholamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, etc., or epinephrine, as you refer to it in the States, can't get through these detoxification pathways. So in mold illness, it's very common they end up with mental health problems, and the mental health problems are due to a detoxification problem. So these patients, you have to look at the chemical profile in their body, because as you mentioned, you've got arsenic. A lot of people could be petrochemicals because they're filling up their car at the Bowser, and that could be increasing their toxic load because they don't have gene pathways or enzymes to be able to detox that. So that's escalating their chemical exposure, which means they're going to be more susceptible to even mold. Because of course, with mold, you get a lot of metabolites, you get yeast overgrowth that blocks the pathways in the liver, which means your normal endogenous environment chemicals like your catecholamines, etc., can't get through. So it has these long-term effects that affects multiple organs in the body. So to me, I tell my patients, it's important that you do an overall chemical test, because you could be exposed, like you are, Eric, to arsenic in your bore water. That's why, to me, these patients need reverse osmosis water filtration systems to make sure they're not getting the fluoride, they're not getting the aluminium, they're not getting, flame retardants in their drinking water. I mean, you've got amazing amount of research in the US, Love Canal, etc., of toxicity in your bore water that is dramatically escalating your cancer risks and other health pathologies. So you want drinking, you must have a reverse osmosis filter. You need air purifiers in a home. If people can't move out of water damaged homes, at the very least, they need dehumidifiers to reduce the humidity. They need air purifiers, which work pretty well at reducing the fungal particulate in the air of those rooms. But they need to do a detoxification panel to look at their chemicals in their body. They need to look at their electromagnetic fields to reduce that exposure. Once they've done that, I find that's when they tend to get better and get more aware of those exposures in order to manage the risks so that they can live relatively normally in a Western society.
I don't know if you're familiar with the geography of California. We've got the San Joaquin agricultural region, which is heavily bombarded with pesticides. And we've actually got some children who, I guess the parents were exposed to a lot of pesticides, but the children are growing up with an inability to detoxify these pesticides. So the doctors were able to identify that they were susceptible to pesticides, and yet they said this was a genetic problem, and they did not advise them to move out of the region. So I was wondering if Sears, when you diagnose somebody with having all these, detoxification problems and different exposures, what the next step is in terms of identifying specifically what they can do to alter their environment to best take control of their illness.
Yeah, that's a great question. Pesticides are the worst. I mean, if you look at the impact of pesticides, especially organochlorine pesticides, which we used in the 60s and 70s, you'll notice a dramatic escalation in chronic disease development. When they changed farming practices after World War II and introduced the organochlorines, that's when a lot of the neurodevelopmental disorders like autism and ADHD dramatically escalated. I mean, autism in 1970 in Australia affected 1 in 10,000 children. Now it's up to 1 in 3 in some communities in Australia, often farming communities. And on an overall, I think it's about 1 in 40 in the general population. That is a dramatic increase compared to the past. And yes, better diagnosis has certainly improved it, but that alone cannot account for the dramatic increase in autism and ADHD. ADHD affects 11% of children around the world. So pesticides, interesting thing about pesticides is most of them are antibacterial. This is why we use pesticides in women's care, moisturizers, and in general products we use preservatives, and they're often pesticides. Pesticides affect the microbiome. They affect the gut microbiome. So we now know your gut microbiome is the most important health marker that we have. The more diverse the bacteria is in the gut, the healthier you tend to be. When you're ingesting water containing pesticides, you are potentially impacting your gut microbiome. When you're ingesting water with chlorine in it, which is a very strong antibacterial, you are impacting your gut microbiome. So when they change farming practices and introduced these pesticides, neurodevelopmental disorders went up, neurodegenerative disorders, Parkinson's, dementia just skyrocketed. And I don't think it's a coincidence, because it's indirect impact on the neurological system, but especially because they're antibacterial and they're impacting the microbiome within our body. So pesticides are definitely my #1 problematic chemical. If you in your gene profile have homozygous for the PON gene, which helps deal with pesticides, especially the organophosphates, you're in big trouble, because the chemicals are just going to be sitting there in your body accumulating over time, which means they're going to be impacting your detoxification pathways. So if you go into a water damaged building, you're already compromised, you're already susceptible. So to do this work properly, we have to look at the scope of chemical exposure, mold exposure, EMF exposure, because they're all interacting to ultimately affect and increase the risk of chronic disease in the general population. And it's not just SIRS, moldy environments cause recurrent colds and flus, pneumonia, respiratory tract infections in healthy people if they're in those environments long enough. EMFs and chemicals are just going to create the perfect storm. And that's what I believe is actually going on. It's the perfect storm. It's a dramatic increase in environmental exposures to moldy environments. Electromagnetic fields are off the chart now. We have Wi-Fi enabled devices, extenders, boosters, routers in our home, which are affecting our cell at a cellular level, reducing melatonin so we don't sleep very well, accelerating oxidative stress. And it's a perfect storm. It's worst case scenario.
I know that in Australia, the chronic fatigue syndrome community is particularly put upon by Professor Andrew Lloyd and the psychosomatic crowd that are trying to tell people that this is mostly or all in your head. So what do you do when people have a chronic fatigue syndrome diagnosis and they come to you for help?
Well, I go through a proper environmental exposure history. I then look at the timing of exposure. Were they in water damaged buildings? Were they exposed to high levels of electromagnetic fields? What is their chemical load? To make sure they get to a naturopath or an integrative doctor that can assess the chemical load and assess for biomarkers for mold, which is more indicative and shows strong correlation. If they're still in the environment that's causing the problem, the building biologist will go in and test the building. So, if there's been a history of water events, roof issues, drainage problems, living in high humidity, we'll go in and test the fungal particulate load. And then we'll have evidence where we can start looking at timing of exposure, what they're actually exposed to now, and then educate them how to reduce their risk, how to deal with the fungal particulate if it's still in the home, how to reduce their electromagnetic field exposures, how to reduce their chemical exposures. So yeah, there are people like that who say that, but often it's because they're ignorant and they've not even looked at the data, so I ignore them. And just deal and listen to the patient. That's been the biggest thing I've learned from being in this industry for 30 years is that the patient, they've been diagnosed with a psychological profile because the people who are diagnosing them have no understanding of the importance of nutrition, of the importance of environmental exposures. So they've gone through multiple practitioners. They've been labeled with a mental illness that is actually not a true mental illness. It's an environmentally induced illness. And what we do is we go backwards. We look at their symptoms, we look at what their exposures are, and then we're able to guide them and through testing of both their body through a good integrative clinician, as well as their home, if it's still there, and then start piecing things together to get them onto the road of recovery.
Have you been successful in lifting people out of this trivializing diagnosis and get them into a credible diagnostic entity that is taken seriously?
Yes, absolutely. So we often ignore the medical profession in that process and we get on to integrative clinicians and naturopath who knows what's going on. I mean, at the ground level, I'm seeing quite a lot of women diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. It's not multiple sclerosis, it's mold. Because the timing of exposure was really clear. They were very healthy, then they developed the symptoms and gradually over a period of months or years, develop these fibromyalgic type symptoms, brain fog, poor concentration, poor memory, missing words mid-sentence, sleep disturbances, classic mold symptoms. And you realise when you take the exposure history, it happened after a water event in the house or after they moved into a water damaged home. It's not rocket science. So then by testing the building and quantifying the fungal particulate, doing air and surface sampling, doing moisture mapping, etc., we're then able to show the integrated clinician this is definitely an issue, get them to the right clinician to provide the binders, provide the treatment, detoxify them over a period of time, get them out of the water damaged building, and suddenly the doctor must have got the diagnosis wrong. It's not MS, it's actually the client's better again. When in fact the medical profession didn't realise it was mold that causes the symptoms.
So once somebody has been steered to the right clinician who can validate their illness with all these tests and substantiate that there really is immunological damage, what name are they given at that point?
Well, with the integrated clinician or naturopath would refer to them as SIRS generally.
It's SIRS.
Yeah. Chronic inflammatory response. I think it's a good term because it is a chronic inflammatory response, whether it's electromagnetic fields, chemicals, multiple chemical sensitivity, or mold. Yes, they often will be diagnosed with SIRS with an integrative clinician. So there are doctors here who specialize in nutrition who have an understanding of SIRS. There aren't many of them, but they are here. And there are a lot of a growing number of naturopaths who are really good in this space as well. So they are diagnosed. They have to ignore the medical fraternity and go down this path with other practitioners to help them get better.
So Macquarie University got over $1 million grant to study biotoxin illness. And of course, part of that will be assessing whether or not SIRS has any relationship to other health effects, such as chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, MS. So have they approached you to ask just how mold plays into this?
It's remarkable. I run the only mold testing course in Australia and I haven't been approached by them.
Wow.
They're doing Swiffer cloths, yeah. I know in terms of testing the home, they're doing Swiffer cloths. I have issues with that. It's the RMIT test for Swiffer cloths because I found many of my clients have a false negative because they don't know where to wipe in the home. So unless they're doing moisture mapping, a good visual inspection, which they need to be trained to do, doing a Swiffer cloth actually I don't think is useful because I've seen too many false negatives. If I go and do a Swiffer cloth, by the time I do a Swiffer cloth, I've spent 2 hours in the property, moisture mapping, thermal imaging, visual inspection, asking questions. Then I know where to do the wiping for the Swiffer cloth to pick up fungal particulate. So, you know, these are the issues I have. And this is a problem with these research. They should have actually done extensive research to see who's in this space, especially if they're going to start looking at water damaged homes. As I said, I run the only government accredited mold testing course. It's 150 hours. And I wasn't approached to, you know, even though they're looking at testing the home to verify if they're water damaged. I can tell you if they're using a Swiffer cloth, they're going to get a lot of false negatives.
That's stunning. I mean, I don't see how they can even pretend to do a credible study if they don't approach the established experts in the field.
I don't know.
Wow.
We
So,
see it time and time again.
Yeah, I think I'm going to ask them that. Why aren't you talking with people who've been in this field for decades?
Yes, I did approach them and it went nowhere. So they'd already established and put their research through ethics. So it had already been passed. They couldn't do anything about it. It's a shame because I do see a lot of false negatives with the Swiffer cloth, I have to say. And many of these clients with the ERMI have gone, your house, the lab has said from the ERMI result, your house is healthy. We've gone in there as part of training because they've got asthma, allergies, and chronic fatigue symptoms. They've got SIRS-related symptoms. And I'm going, when did it begin? It began in this house. I said, the ERMI results can't be right because if your symptoms began in the house and you've got these symptoms, there has to be something in the house and my job is to find it. When we did the results and the air and surface samples, it was so contaminated. We found Stachybotrys in the thousands. It was extraordinary in the bedroom. It was so bad. They walked out of that house with their clothes on and everything else was contaminated. And that house had been cleared with ERMI, with a Swiffer cloth that she had done but didn't know how to do it properly. I have issues with labs sending out results to clients and doing a plate sample, doing a little air sample. You know, a lady rang me last week and said, oh, I'm a health practitioner. I did a samples in my house and I want advice. I go, oh my God, was it a building biologist? No. So she said, oh, I said, what was the spore count in your water damaged room? She said it was 2 spores per cubic meter. And I went, that's not possible. A healthy home has more spores than that. She goes, well, I did it and I just got it from the lab and I don't understand. It's the air results are showing I don't have a problem. I said, well, there's a possibility you don't have a problem, but to have 2 spore counts, the only time I find that is if you had the air purifier on. She said, oh, I had the air purifier on when I did the testing. I said, well, then the results are null and void. These are the things you should know. If you're going to do testing yourself, you need to know the background, under what conditions you test. You should be doing moisture mapping. So a lot of the labs are making money sending these tests out, but the clients don't know what they're doing and they're often getting results that don't mean anything or have been impacted by other factors that they don't know about. So I think I'm developing a short course on mold exposure for the public so they don't get hoodwinked into these ridiculous fogging and ozone and all this BS, what to look for in a proper remediator. You know, if you're doing testing, what the practitioner should be actually doing, what questions they should ask, environmental exposure histories, because I'm seeing too many members of the public going through these people who were taking them for a ride. And a lot of these, especially remediators, actually don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, and what we see, and I believe Alicia can attest to this, the testing failures for Stachybotrys in particular are so rampant that it's reliably unreliable.
Yes, Stachy is a big one because Stachybotrys is a tertiary colonizer, so you need long-term water damage for it to even be there. But the other thing is it stays on the surface most of the time. It's rare to find it airborne unless it's been disturbed. More often than not, we're going to find Stachy in carpets that are wet. So a question I have in my exposure history is, have any of the carpets or underlay been wet or been exposed to liquid water? And if they say yes, and they haven't removed the carpet, that's a massive red flag. If that carpet wasn't removed in 48 hours, there's going to be Aspergillus, Penicillium, Stachybotrys. So wet carpets that were never removed, massive red flag. There's going to be high levels of fungal particulate in the air sample. And if you take up the carpet, you must wear full face respirator gloves. You'll often find tertiary colonizers like Eutomium and Stachybotrys there, which is very, very deadly. It's a very big health problem.
Have you seen people walk out of Stachybotrys, literally abandon their clothes, abandon everything, and it seems like they just can't break free of this stuff?
Yes, so you mean they're out of the water damaged environment and they're still sick?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So you need not just the building biologist to test and to provide recommendations on how to remediate, and then the proper remediator to come in. You also need a good clinician to be able to provide the binders and the treatment. The problem is, once people are diagnosed with SIRS, they're so chemically sensitive, they can't take supplements. Like they take vitamins and they're sick, they're nauseous and vomiting. Why? Because they're chemical overload. So you have to start with the basics: clean air, clean water. You've got to start with a water filter. You've got to start with no personal care products on their body. You've got to look at their washing powders because their chemicals are already overloaded. You have to go back to the basics. You cannot give them a bag full of herbs and supplements because their detoxification pathways are so clogged. There's so many traffic jams, they can't cope with a vitamin. So that's why you have to go back to basic health: clean air, clean water, no chemicals, no moisturizers, no makeup, none of this, to reduce their chemical load, and then feed in the binders in minute amounts, not normal amounts, but tiny amounts, and a little bit of charcoal, a little bit of the binders, very small amounts over a long period of time to gently get them back and get the detoxification pathways working. At the same time, making sure they're not using the cell phone right next to the ear. They're not sleeping near the router. They don't have Wi-Fi enabled devices in their room. Otherwise, they're not going to get sleep. EMFs affect sleep quicker than anything else. So they can't have smart meters, meter panels near their bedrooms. They can't have Wi-Fi enabled devices near their bedrooms, or they're never going to get better. So these are the things. And that's why in the book, I look at how to reduce exposure to all of those things step by step. But with SIRS, it's about a chemical detoxification process, making sure they're out of the environments, number one, and then looking at their chemical overload and reducing those chemicals in every possible way. Their washing powders, their makeup, their personal care, their drinking water especially, and their air. They're not spraying pesticides in the house. They're not bringing, chemicals, anti-stain chemicals on their furnishings to prevent, it being marked. All the chemicals need to be reduced, especially the pesticides.
Well, we just had a briefing by the American National Institutes of Health, Dr. Walter Koroshetz, and he disavowed any knowledge of any of this. They're claiming that they haven't got a clue to start with. How do we get this information into the hands of our federal authorities?
Look, research is the way to go. There's no doubt about it. But the thing is, you can't get funding. And when you do get funding, well, the funding goes to researchers who are already established in the industry, who actually don't know this very well at all. And they often don't know what questions to ask. So it's broken across the whole cycle because you're getting professors, many of whom don't even know what's going on, and they're not liaising with patients with SIRS. Whereas us, we're at the ground level. We're seeing this every day. I'm seeing multiple sclerosis in a lot of these clients. It's not MS, it started with mold. But because the doctors aren't taking environmental exposure histories, the researchers are not familiar with this space. So they're coming up with plans on how to do research, but they don't even know what questions to ask because they've never dealt with patients with SIRS. It's systemic failures across multiple industries. With electromagnetic fields, it's near impossible to get funding because you're stepping on multi-trillion-dollar telecommunication industry. You're dealing with, and this is what I write about in my book, exposure standards for chemicals, electromagnetic fields are not health-based standards. They're compromised with the industry to determine what's practicable in a workplace. That's the problem.
Absolutely. That's the problem.
Fantastic, Nicole. You're a firecracker. Wow. Thank you so much. This is such great information. And, I know that you're a PhD candidate and, you're going to start that, or you are already. But I'm just curious as to what you're researching. What are you basing your studies on?
Well, I've submitted my dissertation, so I'm waiting for it to be marked. So I'm at the tail end, thank God. I'm looking at environmental exposures on human health and ramifications for general medical practice. So the first research paper I published was the impact of environmental chemicals on human health and the complexities that doctors face trying to look at chemical exposures, gene profiles, synergistic effects. I looked at how exposure standards for chemicals are completely inadequate in the way we assess chemicals. We look at one chemical on a group of rats, give increasing doses until 50% die to establish the LD50, lethal dose 50. It's completely inadequate. It's completely inadequate. As you know, large population biomonitoring studies, such as the National Health and Nutritional Examination Survey in the US, is testing 3,000 members of its population every 5 years or so. And we're finding every generation more and more polluted. More and more of us are polluted. We have hundreds of chemicals. There are over 195 million chemicals registered for use on the world's largest database, the Chemical Abstract Service. Every 60 seconds, another 20 chemicals are registered. That's 200,000 chemicals every week. It's extraordinary. This is out of control. 90% have never been tested for their impact on human health. So what I realized when I started the college is the revolution's never going to happen from the top down because there's too much money to be made. It has to be happen from the ground up, establish an institution, train people in building biology to get out to everyone's home and educate them. You can't make informed choices because exposure standards are not public health based. So you have to educate people what's going on so they can make informed choices. Yeah.
Sounds like we need to call Elon Musk and take a flight out of here and go to Mars and start all over again. It's just,
well,
it's so overwhelming,
Yeah, well, look, it's a capitalist society. I'm not anti-capitalist, but the reality is in the end, it's dividends for shareholders. And that often comes at the cost of human health. We've seen that time and time again. Environmental tobacco smoke. The problem with the scientific methodology, and having gone through the university system, it's become really clear to me, is that, it showed to establish evidence-based medicine and causation is almost impossible. It's weighted to industry to keep their products on the market. For 50 years, like environmental tobacco smoke, asbestos, lead, because to show causation, you need so much research to show that. That takes decades. And that's done it, that the burden of proof isn't on industry to prove that it's not harmful. Instead, it's on researchers to prove it's dangerous. It's ridiculous. The system is stuffed. If people are going to launch things into the marketplace, they should prove it's safe before it goes to the public. This is what the public think is going on. That's not what's going on. We can produce whatever we want. Yes, you have the REACH directive, you have the Toxic Substance Control Act in the US, but it's still not adequate. You have a grandfather clause, and I talk about that in my first paper. The second paper I published was interviewing the top environmental doctors in New Zealand, Australia, to see how they deal with patients with environmental sensitivities and chronic fatigue syndrome. These doctors are saying, we were not trained in our undergraduate or postgraduate medical course to deal with these patients. You have to, the most important clinical tool you have, and this was my research question, how do you help these patients with chronic fatigue and what tests do you do to help them? And in the end, after interviewing all these doctors, they said the most important clinical tool a doctor has is the environmental exposure history, but none of us were trained how to do it. by listening to our patients over 2, 3, or 4 decades of general medical practice, we've come up with our own exposure history because we found that's the most useful tool to help with these patients to find the timing of exposure and what they were exposed to. So 2 journals, medical journals, rejected that paper, which is about all of the outcomes of what the doctors were saying, the problems with what they were trained, how they're dealing with these patients with environmental sensitivities. 2 medical journals rejected the paper because it wasn't relevant to medicine. Like, what the hell? That's without using the F word I want to. That's ridiculous. It just shows me. Here are doctors saying the system is failing them as doctors who are trying to help these patients. And the medical journals are saying this is not relevant to medicine. So to me and my professor, they were going, this is stuffed. This is about money at a much higher level. It's not about general medical health. It's not about public health. So the 3rd paper I'm about to publish is a randomized controlled trial on the impact of a baby monitor on healthy adult sleep, and it's statistically significant. So I was able to show that when a baby monitor is in the bedroom of healthy adults, that it impacted their non-REM sleep to the point that it affected their sleep patterns. Now, it's very difficult to try and publish this because it's stepping on too many toes, because the baby monitor is a proxy for every Wi-Fi enabled device. Wi-Fi enabled devices shouldn't be in bedrooms. They affect non-REM sleep.
Yeah, thank you for that. Go ahead, Eric.
I was just going to ask if you had any experience with Dr. Sprott and his BabeSafe system, where they were wrapping old mattresses with an impermeable membrane to prevent sudden infant death syndrome from toxic emissions from the mattresses.
Yeah, mattresses have an interesting history, especially in Italy. They used arsenic, and that caused a huge amount of problems with the baby exposures, and babies did die. I think it was around the 1920s or so, because they're using flame retardants. A lot of the mattresses, recently we had a recall here in Australia where the cribs, the cots, were actually contaminated with mold because they're on boats and they're already getting exposed to moisture either at the timber mill or on the boat. And when they came in, there was all this mold and all these kids were getting sick. This was only like a month ago in Australia. So a lot of this furnishing that's imported is already pre-contaminated with fungi. That's a problem. But yes, flame retardants in cots are a big issue. Electromagnetic fields, baby monitors emit some of the highest radio frequencies than any other Wi-Fi enabled device. So they should not be in children's room. If you're going to have to monitor your baby because they're at risk of sudden infant death syndrome, use a hardwired CCTV or a hardwired baby monitor instead.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to disappear there. Yeah, I mean, this is just such great information, and I really can feel the passion from you in this subject matter. I mean, this is important. I think we all understand how important this is. And I know that Australia has just been taking such a massive beating with flooding and infrastructure damage. What is the government doing? Are they providing subsidies to people who are losing their homes? Is there money that's going to be injected into improving the infrastructure there? What's going on over there?
No, it's a disaster here, really. So, and basically what's going on is people coming in, the insurance companies are coming in, they're then getting the average Joe Blow to assess the property who has no formal training in mold testing to determine how much can be claimed on insurance. These homes, many of these homes are remaining water damaged for over a year, like not 48 hours, that's all you've got, over a year. They're not habitable. So it's just a disaster here because they're not getting people who have trained to do mold testing to test the homes. They're getting remediators in who may or may not be IICRC accredited, who may or may not be following IICRC protocol. And remember, most of the IICRC mold remediators haven't done any formal training in testing. So this is where the system is constantly broken. So yes, these homes in Lismore and the Central Coast, it's a disaster. Whole communities have been decimated by the flooding and the lack of capacity to help these clients test these buildings and be able to remediate. A lot of the remediation that's being done isn't adequate. And, you know, I would think in a lot of these homes, they just need to be bulldozed and they need to be rebuilt. However, my real question is, why are these homes built in floodplains? I mean, that's insanity. You know, recently I did an assessment in Sydney in a different state because I'm based in Melbourne. And here's a house where we're going through, it's quite water damaged, and the kids have had recurrent tonsillitis, the mother has chronic fatigue symptoms, SIRS. And I said, when did it begin? Oh, we've had 2 flood events in this street. The stormwater system is overflowed. This house is, and the whole street's built on a floodplain. So the water comes up to a metre. So when I took this history in the first 10 minutes with my 14 students, I said, guys, game over. Because it's all very well for CART to come here to test and to remediate. Most buildings can be remediated. But the reality is, can we prevent this happening again? No, we can't. So I would say to her right then and there, move. Because as a building biologist, prevention is key. How do we stop this happening? What caused the mold in the first place? Do you need to fix the roof? Do you have to improve the drainage? Do you have to change your behavior around the exhaust fans and turning them on when you're showering? This case is the street floods. It's a floodplain. What council allows someone to build in a floodplain? Brisbane, a lot of it's a floodplain. Parts of Sydney are a floodplain. Parts of Melbourne. I go into people's homes and there's a river under their subfloor. I go, I'm sorry, move. This cannot be fixed unless you're going to spend $60,000 in drainage, if you even can do that, divert the water away. So this is the problem: systemic failures across multiple industries, building construction, medicine, natural therapies, in so far as not diagnosing patients properly, trades, plumbers who have no idea, you know, what they're doing, remediators who don't know what they're doing, governments who have no idea what's happening at the ground level. It's failures across multiple industries. It's just crazy.
Yeah, we saw, you know, we're in a ton of groups, support groups to help people. And I saw one in a remediation group where, you know, the inspector did good. They had a wonderful remediation plan, you know, step-by-step, thorough. But the remediator didn't follow anything on the plan. It was like, are you kidding me? Like, this is insane. It's just the I don't know, the ignorance, the willingness, the easiness to take advantage of others while they're in a bad situation. That it really breaks my heart, and I'm sure it's happening there too.
Absolutely.
And we just had a chat with Dr. Amy Skilton, such a great person. She actually was impacted by mold in Australia. And she was telling us that she's been made hypersensitive, that she can't go to restaurants, she can't go to movie theaters. There's only certain hotels that she can actually visit within the region. And I'm curious as to what is your experience? Because it sounds like you were severely compromised in your home. Would you say that you are also a person that may have been made hypersensitive? Can you walk into a building and feel the mold or the badness in a building?
No. Look, electromagnetic fields, definitely I find I tend to get brain fog, poor concentration and memory if I'm exposed to EMFs. I have a history of being exposed to high EMFs. I used to walk along high voltage transmission lines when I was living at my parents' place. So, you know, walking up to 5-10 kilometers a day, and the pathway was beautiful, but then there was a part where there's high levels of high voltage transmission lines. My office at some point had high levels of magnetic fields because the concrete slab was holding current. Every time the Chinese restaurant next to me came to work and put the ovens on, it would create high levels of current on the concrete slab. And it was only when I was getting headaches and fatigue and put my Gauss meter on, I'm going, oh my God, it's absolutely high. Here I am running a college in environmental sensitivities. So yes, I find that not so much the mold, etc. But it is something that, you know, I'll quantify that with the instruments I have, asking environmental exposure questions. Obviously, I've tested my house to make sure that it's dry, that it's clean, that it's low in EMFs, low in chemicals, low in, it hasn't, you know, the mold is normal fungal ecology. So yes, absolutely. What's the problem is that in a Western society, in a built up area, it's becoming impossible to be in a clean environment. In a built up area, you're exposed to high levels of radio frequencies from Wi-Fi enabled devices from your neighbors, above you, below you, beside you. So when people do my course, which is a 2-year full-time, 4-year part-time course, by the end of it, most of them move out of built up areas and go to the country, where there are still issues, by the way, but they're able to manage it. Because if you can't manage your immediate environment, then you never really get better.
Absolutely, I agree. There is one aspect to Stachybotrys that we find really unique in that it is radiomimemic. So in a way, it's its own little radiation transmitter. And it's crazy because with people who are hypersensitive like me, Eric Keeley, if there is a Stachybotrys colony or a trichothecene producing mold colony within that building, we can point it out right away and say, this is bothering me. And so it's like, I wonder how much is the EMF amplifying Stachybotrys's radiomimemic properties? Like, there's so many unknowns we don't know. And it would be so interesting, man. It would be really cool to do a research study. If you can pull this off, this would be amazing. A research study on EMFs and how it actually affects a mold colony. I know Klinghardt has his own theory that he, did a Faraday cage study and his own little study that wasn't published, and came to the conclusion that when an EMF emitter is near a colony, it's, that colony is producing 600 times more mycotoxins because of this relationship. So I'm wondering if, if you know of any studies that may be happening, or if that's something that you're interested in looking into in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. These are important questions that need to be answered. No doubt about it. I mean, we know electromagnetic fields potentiate the impact of chemicals on the body. And there was an interesting study on black carbon causing adverse health effects in rodents. But when you expose the rodents to black carbon and electromagnetic fields, you quadrupled its adverse health effects. So definitely, this is the issue now we have with exposures, is the synergistic effects and additive effects of multiple parameters. So multiple chemicals, electromagnetic fields, biotoxins, because the reality is us as humans, we're exposed to this. We're exposed to the biotoxins and the chemicals and the EMFs. But in research, you're only looking at one cause, one effect, which is completely limiting. We need large population data sets in order to be able to look at the synergistic effects. And I think the only way to go forward with this in research is metabolomics, where we're looking at the metabolites, because it's the downstream effects of both the gene interplay and the chemical interplay, that through the metabolites that we're actually ultimately seeing the impact of the environment on that human being. Metabolomics is the only way to go that I can see future in understanding environmental sensitivities.
Thank you for that. The US right now is really gung-ho on trying to solve long COVID. Long COVID is a big problem in our country, and they're trying to lump chronic fatigue syndrome into this long COVID. Now, according to Eric's experience, he's actually a prototype for CFS syndrome, for the coining of the syndrome. And what was found when that syndrome was created was actually toxic black mold. So I'm curious as to what Australia is doing. Are they interested in long COVID? Are they looking into it? Are they kind of lumping CFS into long COVID, and any progression on that?
Yeah, they're basically keeping long COVID separate from environmental sensitivities, I guess, because there's not a lot of data between it, but the symptoms are almost identical to SIRS, aren't they? They're almost identical. And of course, these patients may already have been very sensitive to environmental, and then the vaccine and or the infection has just brought them into a SIRS pattern. But of course, they're ignoring all the environmental sensitivities that resulted in them being susceptible in the first place. So no, the government's not doing anything about it. They're just saying, oh, we've got long COVID, and that's the poor people who have that. End of story. Nothing else is discussed.
Yeah, that's really a shame, because I mean, I can't tell you how many guests that we've had on the show that are from all different walks of life, doctors, researchers, and they all say the same thing that you do. Like, long COVID is very strangely linked to environmental illness, and that's getting left out into the narrative. And so it'll be interesting to see how it plays out here in the US. Because again, they're just kind of lumping the two together, CFS and long COVID, and focusing on biomarkers and all that, and ignoring the larger picture of it all. And that's what's happening in the environment and what's going on with this infection versus, the shot. So, but
If they
Go ahead.
do that, they have to acknowledge that there's systemic failures in the building construction industry. They have to acknowledge that the telecommunications rolling out frequencies that may actually not be good for human health. We're talking about multi-trillion-dollar industries, so they're not going to do that.
Yeah, I'm going to tell you guys a funny story. So my husband and I are nomadic and we travel around, we camp, we go to RV parks and we meet a great ton of people. And we met this couple from Boston and the husband actually worked for the Carpenters Union. Now he was, like a little guy, but still played an impactful role within the union. And he saw a lot of crazy things, like the Carpenters Union. Their main headquarters is near, I think it's right next door to the White House. There was a lot of mob-like situations happening within the union back in the day. And so it's like, then you start to like look at this deeper, and I'm thinking like, wow, I wonder if this is all mixed together, like organized crime along with the Carpenters Union, along with the building, construction and whatever goes along with that. It's all just this one big capitalistic game that we're all being played here. And I mean, at the end of the day, we're suffering, right? A lot of people are getting ill or being made sick, and everyone is just sort of turning a blind eye from this.
Yes, to all of the above.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
I didn't tell you that story, Eric, so I wanted to share that. But yeah, Nicole, well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Keely, I think her kids are she's tending to them. Eric, did you have any last questions?
No, I think that's about wraps it up.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. We appreciate you coming on the show. We do have a large listenership from Australia. So if anyone wanted to consult with you or find your information or buy your book, where can they do that?
Yes, so you can get the book on Book Depository or Booktopia. It's Healthy Home, Healthy Family. And my personal website's buildingbiology.com.au. And the college is the Australian College of Environmental Studies. The Association of Building Biologists is Australasian Society of Building Biologists, asbb.org.au. So you can get a building biologist in your area through that website.
Thank you so much for the wonderful information, and we appreciate your hard work in this industry, and we look forward to seeing what you do in the future. Thank you everyone for listening today. We'll have Keely, she's going to have to go ahead and stop the recording, but Nicole, feel free to, leave, or if you want to stay and chat more, we totally can. Up to you.
Sure. I'm going to get the kids up for school.
I know. It's early there, right?
It is, yeah. 6 o'clock. I got up at 10 to 6 and went, oh my God, I've got the interview. I forgot. That's why I'm a bit croaky.
No, you're totally fine. It seems like you had your cup of coffee, so you were going, you did great.
Yeah, no, I'm very passionate about this. Very, very passionate about this for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Great.
yeah. It's hard work, but we're trying to make as much progress as we can.
Fantastic. Great. Well, look, when this goes live, etc., or let me know and send me a link so I can send it out to my social media.
I absolutely will.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
What'd you think?
So we have no way to cut off the recording, eh?
Yeah. Like I need to message Keely.
Well, thanks for asking, because it was fascinating to watch. You mentioned that Eric is a prototype for chronic fatigue syndrome, and she didn't even blink.
Yeah, I was waiting for her to say something, about long COVID and CFS, but she just didn't.
How could somebody spout every detail from Dr. Shoemaker's books, and yet the fact of mold at ground zero for chronic fatigue syndrome has no impact on their imagination whatsoever?
Yeah. I don't know. I felt like she was very self-assured. Like it felt like she pretty much knew everything there was to know.
That is a bit of a problem, because she puts out all these great explanations for why this is happening. Tight buildings, more pesticides, more chemicals, building in a floodplain, lousy construction techniques. And it all sounds like such a good, reasonable explanation that you wouldn't even stop to consider, wow, why did this happen all over the world, no matter what kind of construction, even if it was an old construction that wasn't altered?
I mean, her explanation basically made me want to go jump off a cliff because I feel like all humanity is doomed. I was like, so basically, Nicole, what you're saying is we should be living underground in a hole and not eat, drink, breathe, or nothing. Because that's what you're making it sound like everything is fucking toxic and terrible.
Well, caves are okay, but if they're on the top of a mountain, not down low.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, I don't know what to make of all that explanation and all that talking. That's why I was like, look, we got to call Elon Musk and just head to Mars because we're fucked.
Yeah, people accuse me of fear mongering. It's like, wow, I'm kind of the opposite. I say just by attending to the effect that the badness that I associate with Stachybotrys, I haven't had to worry about all the chemicals and the pesticides and all the other stuff.
Yeah, it's like a different aspect, different view of it all. And I don't know, it's just, I don't know. It sounded like she knew, like she gave, mold illness. She was talking about how mold illness is a cause for this, but it's actually not, it's EMF. I just felt kind of confused with the way she was going because it just sounded like she was describing toxic soup.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It wasn't like a definitive direction, or it was just kind of like, oh, if you're this, then you're EMF. Oh, if you're this, well, it's pesticides. Or if you're this, it's mold illness. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah, it's this idea that, well, we don't really need to assign a name to anything. We can just consider it to be toxic soup. Well, that may be true, maybe we're drowning in toxins. But if you approach the problem that way, you don't identify anything new that crept into the equation.
Yeah.
You're not even looking.
I mean, for her to say she's not hypersensitive, but she can feel EMS, I'm like, oh yeah, you're the only time I feel EMF problems is when I'm in a bad zone. So it's like, you might want to look into that. Might want to direct your studies to make sure that you're actually, finding your culprit, and maybe it's not EMF, maybe it is the molds.
Yeah, who am I to say? If somebody claims that they're really reactive to EMFs, well, maybe they are. But
Yeah.
from my perspective, I'd still want to know if they're being exposed to Stachybotrys.
Yeah, that's true. All right, I'm gonna head out. I'm so hot. I'm sweating my ass off. I have to turn on the AC.
Okay, see you later.
Okay, bye.